And when you look at that, they are suggesting essentially that on his right-hand side, he hits a higher peak force than he does on his left-hand side. It's a faster ground contact time, a higher peak force, and is that a function of this lateral flexion? I would argue, yeah, maybe. And so if that's the case, he's somewhat asymmetrical because he's got more scoliosis to the right-hand side than he is to the left. So it begs the question, should we be training lateral flexion per se? And is range of motion a critical factor? And I'm sure we'll get on to some of the other stuff with Jerome Simian in a minute, but if you look at Kevin Meyer, who's one of he's the world record holder in the decathlon, he's a guy that has trained in some of the isometric stuff they do. He's trained a lot of lateral flexion, and in the time he's been with Jerome, he's progressed from about 11 flat, 11-1 100-meter runner to a 10-50 100-meter runner.
That was Angus Ross, and you're listening to the Just Fly Performance Podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by our longtime sponsor, SimplyFaster.com. There's 2 items I'd like to talk to you about today that you can find in Simply Faster's online store. Whether you're a coach or an athlete, these are both things that you'll find highly useful as tools in your training toolbox. The first is blood flow restriction training methods. And after hearing about blood flow restriction training for years now, as well as the results that athletes are getting with it, especially in, for example, lactate sports like swimming, 100-meter freestyle, and not only hearing of that, but also seeing how much some swimmers had liked that type of training method, I knew I had to start trying it out myself. So I've been utilizing the air bands. I really enjoy it, both the feeling of training while I'm actually training with them, as well as seeing the visual result of spending time training with the methods and then the strength result. They've been a really cool training tool, and I would definitely recommend checking into air bands. SimplyFaster.com also has Be Strong brand blood flow restriction. The second item is the VMAX Pro, and this is a new option for velocity-based training, barbell tracking. It provides valuable load-based data, including speed in all phases of a lift, and it delivers key metrics such as power, velocity, distance, as well as duration of effort. The VMAX Pro system measures any lift you can think of. It's portable, durable, and intuitive. You can check out these 2 items and much more at our sponsor, SimplyFaster.com's online store. Let's get on to the show. In sports performance, many people have heard the idea of the spinal engine. I certainly have, and I've been thinking a lot in the last year or two about the role of the ribs and the spine and the upper body in general in its ability to drive the lower body and coordinate with the lower body to achieve next level performances. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot and really working with is the idea of isometrics, and particularly long isometric holds. With these concepts, I recently reached out to previous guest Angus Ross, and I'm really glad I did. Angus came to this show loaded with information. It blew my mind and it helped me connect a lot of dots, and you guys are really going to enjoy it. Quickly, before we get to some of the topics, Angus Ross, he's been a previous 2-time guest on this show, appeared within the first 100 episodes of the podcast. He is a senior strength and conditioning specialist with High Performance Sport New Zealand, and Angus has a particular interest in track and field athletes, although he has worked with a number of sports at an elite level within the New Zealand system. Angus has a PhD in exercise physiology, and he also has skin in the game as a Winter Olympian in his own right, having competed in the 1998 and 2002 Winter Games. On the show today, really, this was like a kid on Christmas morning for me talking to Angus. He spoke on his take on spinal engine theory and some correlations and specific case studies and observations in elite track and field athletes. He's also going to talk about rhythmic movement, ideas with the martial arts, and then he's going to share a little bit about some ideas that he's been thinking about since his time that he spent learning from Coach Jerome Simian, who also was on this podcast. One of the ideas that particularly stood out to him, and as well as I found fascinating, was the idea of asymmetrical isometric holds, or only doing an isometric on one side, and then how Jerome has progressed Jay Schrader's original just 90-degree kind of straight or sagittal plane oriented holds and added lateral flexion to those, and how that fits with the spinal engine element. Angus is also going to talk about short hold isometrics and then proprioception training. From front to back, this was a phenomenal chat. To me, this is an instant classic. I think that there's so many concepts here that it's like we have this edge of our knowledge in sports performance. And every time I talk to Angus, it's like that edge, that circle grows just a little bit more. It's like, oh yeah, that could fit in too. And And just already in my own training, starting to play around with these things has been a lot of fun. The way I consider and observe human movement. Angus is such a wealth of information. He's such a curious mind. And then add the PhD to all of that, you know you're going to get a great chat. So I'm excited to get you guys this show, episode 265 with Coach Angus Ross. Angus, it's great to have you back on the show. I've heard the term spinal engine a few times, and honestly, it's one of those things that I've looked up a little bit of the definition, what it is, and it's something that I think intuitively I have some understanding and have been working with some ideas around it, but I definitely haven't taken a true deep dive. And so I'm really interested with what you're doing or studying with the spinal engine theory and how you see it play out in various sport activities.
Yeah, cool. So the spinal engine stuff, in my understanding of it at least, I guess it was popularized by Serge Grakovitsky back in the sort of 80s and 90s. And sort of brief terms, the concept is that if you laterally flex a lordotic spine, it induces an axial torque and a rotation of the pelvis. And you know, if you read into that data, there's, and we rotate the trunk with our lat and glute and those slings we have. And you know, the idea is that if your spine is laterally flexing from side to side, you get this the lordosis causes this axial rotation of the pelvis, and that's what drives gait. And it's kind of like, if according to the spinal engine theory, the legs are really this there as amplifiers of the spinal engine. And if you've seen, you know, people with no legs can walk on their ischial tuberosities, and it looks very like walking. And if you consider that the legs are then just amplifiers of that movement of the lateral flexion and that we see in gait, then that's a really interesting concept. And so the whole thing with it, to my mind, and I started going down this rabbit hole a little bit during we had a lockdown for a period of last year, and I was kind of a bit bored and started reading some stuff. And when you look at things through the spinal engine lens, it's really very different to, you know, sort of the mass spring model, which the mass spring model basically characterizes the trunk as a lump of weight, a inert lump of weight that sits on these, you know, these springs of legs. And that's, you know, been probably, you know, and sort of, you know, a lot of biomechanical stuff, it's been the model that we've used. And the mass spring model kind of turns that on its head a little bit and says, hey, well, the trunk is actually what's driving the gait rather than the legs just carrying around this inert lump of meat on top of it. And so, yeah, I've sort of gone down that rabbit hole, and it's, you know, there's certainly a level of validity to it. And I think, you know, both powerful legs and a powerful trunk are both key factors. You don't want one or the other. And I don't think you need to be, you know, polarized into one camp necessarily or the other, but you need to train the whole system. And, you know, like I say, if you accept that the possibility that the trunk may contribute significantly to gait, then obviously there are implications for how you train. And look, I've sort of, if you look at some of our elite runners, elite athletes, you've looked at some footage of Wade van Niekerk and Usain Bolt, who obviously, you know, still the world record in the 100, 200, and 400, and they both, you know, have significant lateral flexion. And, you know, Usain Bolt in particular has a scoliosis to the right hand side, and when you watch him run, he laterally flexes more to one side than the other. So to the right hand side, he laterally flexes as a function of his scoliosis. And, you know, Ken Clark and Peter Weyand and those guys and the SMU lab have mapped some of, you know, his predicted force data as a result of it, you know, the ground force, so his limb lengths and his speeds and his ground contacts at 5 times, etc. And when you look at that, they are suggesting essentially that on his right-hand side, he hits a higher peak force than he does on his left-hand side. It's a faster ground contact time, a higher peak force, and is that a function of this lateral flexion? I would argue, yeah, maybe. And so if that's the case, he's somewhat asymmetrical because he's got more scoliosis to the right-hand side than he is to the left. So it begs the question, should we be training lateral flexion per se? And is range of motion a critical factor? And I'm sure we'll get on to some of the other stuff with Jerome Simian in a minute, but if you look at Kevin Meyer, who's one of he's the world record in the decathlon, he's a guy that has trained in some of the isometric stuff they do. He's trained a lot of lateral flexion. And in the time he's been with Jerome, he's progressed from about 11 flat, 11-1 100-meter runner to a 10-50 100-meter runner.
Yeah, and his stride length is huge too.
Yeah, stride length is huge. And so he's done it 100% by stride length. He was taking about just under 45 steps when he was 22, 23 to run 100, and now he takes 42 steps at 6'1". So he's got this monster stride length. In the Ralph Mann terms, he probably is excessively rear side dominant. He pushes too long, etc., etc., etc. But what it has afforded him is this massive stride length, and his stride rate hasn't changed. probably gets more time on the ground, more time to apply force, more time to produce impulse. But he also bounces down both sides, and he's got this quite dramatic sort of running style in that space. And you look at a lot of these. Sha'Carri Richardson does the same thing. She's a real lateral flexor, and we all know how well she's been running. So is it cause and effect? I'm not sure. I like to think so, but certainly there's more research needs to be done in that space. And I'm trying to chase up a couple of PhD students currently to look at it both biomechanically as well as training. Can we train these things?
Mm-hmm.
If you and I don't do it naturally, should we be training ourselves to do it? Or there's a whole lot of unanswered questions there too. That if you don't have a particularly lordotic spine, is there any point in doing it? Don't know. Is there any ground per se of just doing that? Bang, 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 bang to each side. Is there any ground force as we laterally flex? Possibly. And I guess my other question became out of it is, we typically characterize a long trunk as being a negative in running, but perhaps that's a bigger hammer. If you've got a long trunk and you're using the spinal engine, so most of our elite runners are short trunk, long legs, and that's what we say is the normal. But if you don't have that, can you compensate by becoming a different style of runner and using what you do have to sort of facilitate your ability to become elite? I don't know. I've got a whole lot of questions that I would like to pursue, I suppose, in the next little while. So it's a fascinating space.
Yeah, that's what you just said there at the end is fascinating too. I take that one extra close to my heart because I am long torso, short-legged individual who really likes sprinting and jumping. And I think about it like how maybe it's less of a negative if you do have more of a mobile spine and ribs that can actually move and articulate and maybe try to give you a little bit extra where your legs, you just don't have leg length.
Well, it's just an interesting question. And then it begs the question, how do you train it? And, is it via a therapist? Is it via some mobility work that you can do yourself? And then once you've got that mobility piece, I guess, training strength and actively training lateral flexion and or rotation, how important are they? What are the best modes of doing it? I've been diving into this pretty deeply, and I've got a couple of random bits and pieces. I think we could divide up the 100 meters in terms of the start, acceleration, and max velocities / speed maintenance space. And there are probably different modes of training that the spinal engine stuff for each of those facets. And so, look, it's really interesting.
I agree. I think even in acceleration, you see runners who can just use, honestly, it might almost shine there just as well as anything, because you see runners who can really use the lateral space when they're accelerating. And you have to have that ability to bend, to laterally bend and rotate to do that. If you don't have that, if you put someone, when I was working with swimmers, an exercise we would do a lot was called the Saxon bend, which was an exercise named after, I think it was Arthur Saxon or some famous strongman. And it was basically just holding two dumbbells directly straight over your head and just doing lateral side bending. And I would always tell people, it's like the tree pose in yoga, basically. It's as if your back is on a wall. You don't want to cheat it because you can't. People would go forward to cheat it. And I always found that the swimmers who generally, the majority of swimmers who were very good, and we had a lot of really good swimmers in the group, a lot of people at world championships and Olympics, the better ones seem to really own that spine bending, like just could make a really beautiful arc. And the ones who struggled a little more, just they had to go into more shoulder flexion or extent. Sometimes I mess up the technical term for shoulder flexion extension, but they had to bring the arms down a little bit to actually pull it off. And so it was interesting to see true spinal ability versus kind of people who had to manufacture. They just didn't have the natural motion to do some things. And I think a lot of it, there's almost like this hardware. I mean, it is software. There's breathing and the way the ribs move. But these very core abilities, I feel like you need to be able to pull it off. Like you couldn't take someone whose ribs were glued stuck and didn't rotate much and couldn't side bend. They can't do that. There has to be some things you start with that from a deeper level where you can open that up.
Yeah, 100% agree. And I've started to play with it a little bit here in different athletes, and I've unfortunately had back surgery a few years ago, and trying to demonstrate it myself, I realized how bad I was. I was sort of stemming a couple of those exercises from the Ben Patrick, the knees over toes guy, whatever his name is. He's got on the 45-degree back extension side bends on that. And
the QL.
I tried doing it. Yeah, QL stuff. And I was absolutely pitiful. But it's been interesting. I've been doing it on an almost daily basis, and it's improved dramatically over the course of a month, say. And so I think these things are modifiable. and then be able to move, as you say, with that sort of elegant rhythm and to bounce in and out of some of these positions. So you don't want to become sort of ultra mobile and kind of flaccid in those positions. You want to be able to bounce and store that elastic energy. And so, yeah, there's a lot of IP in it that needs to be developed to enhance it, I reckon. And we sort of certainly have some of these motor geniuses that just do it naturally and have the range, and they feel it. And my questions are, can we train, a more stock standard straight up and down linear runner into that space and then get a performance enhancement? And as you've rightly alluded to, you need the hardware to be able to run that software. And if you can't get in those positions, you can't get in those positions. You and I can give them coaching cues all day long, and it won't do any bloody good because they can't get in those positions anyway. So you need both.
Yeah. There's a few thoughts I have. I guess almost the most core thought that I have with it is Helen Hall, who was on the show a little over a year ago. Shoot, it might have almost been 2 years at this point. I think she was episode 180. Yeah. And her book, Even With Your Shoes On, it's amazing. It's like, it was on the Kindle, it was 500 pages, and I read it in like 2 weeks. I was just like totally absorbed. And her model, she basically mixes like Gary Ward's cogs, which are basically 3D, taking a joint to its full 3D range. So imagine like you said, Jerome Simian and the lunge, like the extreme iso lunge, but then throw lateral flexion on top of that. And I think I saw Dan Fichter doing that too. And that actually, I got to make a note for that one because and we'll talk about the isos here in a bit, but like my muse the last year and a half, really, especially since I read Helen's book. And then I learned, I've been learning some amazing things from some swim coaches over time too that are kind of related. But the idea of how Helen would do it is really like, okay, you're going to start, let's say just running, you're going to start by putting your back on the wall and just taking your spine through kind of like a cat-cow, though the cog is different with what the head does, but you're experiencing spinal motion in the front to back plane, in the sagittal plane, and you're noticing your range essentially, and then you go run. And so you're kind of like, it's a feel-based thing. You're feeling it and you're taking it with you. And then so you got to dial in the sagittal plane first. And that's a big thing with just strength and conditioning that has really come in. And I know Pat Davidson has talked about that, Mike Robertson and some others. And so she'll start there, but then it goes frontal plane. Like now there's like these lateral drills that to get lateral feeling and lateral motion. And I found the lateral drills actually to be fantastic with helping people eliminate crossover running, like people who shouldn't be crossover running. I think there's some bow-legged people like Allison Felix who can, and it's fine. But so like using that, and then she brings in rotation and running it. And so I've been experimenting all over the place with that kind of thing with like just different lunges with twists, different types of crawls. And it's a huge portion of an online course that I'm coming out with soon. And how I've kind of view gait, and I found it to work really well. But the thing where people will struggle is if they miss that core, they don't have that core ability, that just core rib mechanics and rib motion. And again, the movements definitely help, but people who are really stuck, like really, really stuck, that's where I think like David Gray has his core basics and a lot of the stuff that goes into the finer points of the breathing and the spine. It's just, I think different people need a different level of help totally there. And some people I think are almost too far gone. Yeah. I never like to say that, but
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Being a very bound up sort of person myself, I've struggled with that. But doing those the loaded stretches, doing the side bends with a heavy kettlebell and whatever, and I'm developing range, and developing that range with load, which I think is beneficial. And certainly it's a fun little project to experiment with. And I think, but you're absolutely right. You do need those capabilities, or it's relatively worthless.
Yeah, if you're just a brick,
you can't run it. Yeah, exactly. So and trying to force the brick to run in that fashion will be end in tears. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, it's interesting with the asymmetry too, because I've been really into the idea of asymmetry for a few years now. I did a podcast with Darian Barr on it maybe 2 or 3, maybe 3 years ago. Some of these I just forget. Yeah. I'm like, it was a long time ago, and it's always been something I've been interested in. And one of the big things he was talking about was like Juan Miguel Cavaria, his like super long last step, and how his run up was so asymmetrical and kind of mirrored that. But then even with all these sprinters like Bolt, but also there's been a few other sprinters I've been watching recently who have that asymmetry. And there was she broke the college record in the indoor 200. I think she did, from the University of Kentucky here in the States, Abby Steiner. And She's
Oh, I
hugely,
saw that. Yeah.
massively asymmetrical. It was a soccer player, so probably had to play team sports, you have to have probably more mobility through the upper body. I would imagine.
And then she got injured. Obviously, didn't run the outdoor season. I saw. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah,
but she looks like a real talent. But you're right. Yeah, the asymmetrical gait is. And how much do you mess with that? Is another question, isn't it? Like,
how much do you build it in?
Yeah.
I think you can. I just think each person has their own, like Kevin Mayer, right? It's almost like you have your own attributes that you're really good at, right? Maybe it's like just pure horsepower. Maybe it's elasticity, or maybe you have like some mobility, like a long spine and some mobility in there, and you can like really leverage that. I think I don't have a ton of horsepower relative to other athletes, so I think that in looking at how I've solved movement problems, I can see that. And the more I've learned about asymmetry too is, I think Angus Bradley said this on his social media, who was on this podcast not long ago, but it was something to the tune of like asymmetry creates momentum or something like that. And I can feel that. I've done different types of like one arm running. Darian had me do a 300 one arm once just for fun. And
good times.
just doing like a one arm run for 100 meters and then bring the other arm in for the last 50. Like you feel this. And that's the thing where I feel like this is a harder concept for the industry, at least like a lot of the research and database, because it's not as easy as a force plate on the ground. You know what I'm saying? Not that that's easy. I mean, there's a lot of really intelligent work that goes into that, but now you have 3D motion up top. You have a lot of stuff and also the athlete has to feel it. They can't just, it's something you have to feel and process in your own body. You can't just it's not just, hey, do this cue. And not that that's a great idea, I think, oftentimes anyway. So it's super interesting.
No, definitely complicated. And as you say, some of these things have to be felt. I've sort of been playing around with some martial arts stuff as well. And that's the same thing. There's concepts there that don't translate well into sort of that sort of Western way of thinking. But you feel it, you think, oh, maybe there is something there. That's kind of, and it's, for some of that science trained, it's kind of a little bit frustrating. I find that I'm probably a slower on the uptake than some of the other people in the class as because I've got all this interference of, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound biomechanically sound or whatever it is. And so, yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I think just like a lot of people who are just very intuitive coaches can benefit from seeing the data around what they're doing. I think a lot of people who do a lot of data, like the martial arts is so feel and intuitive based. I just had Sam Wiest on, and he was talking about these posture drills that he does before his practice, and he's describing it. I was like, I have no idea. I literally have no idea. Like, I get it. I kind of get it. And he had a video that he shared that was helpful, but it is one of those things that it's really just, it's like Tai Chi. How do I explain? I mean, I haven't even done Tai Chi, but just watching people do it, I don't think you could explain it very well just talking about it. It's something you have to actually embody and feel yourself.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
So what have you been doing in the martial arts with that?
There's a guy, actually a local guy here, who's it's kind of an amalgamation of he's got black belts and half a dozen different things, and he's in his 60s, and he's come up with a sort of amalgamation martial art, I guess. And I just sort of wanted to, as a sort of professional development and movement, I've been doing that for the last couple of years, and certainly, we have our disagreements on how things go or what the function of something is, but he's very much more eclectic than I would characterize myself in terms of how things work and the sort of the spiritual side of things, which I probably struggle with a little bit and stuff like that. But just the movement has been interesting. He's very much into fascial slings and bits and pieces. So look, it's been fun, and I'm trying to keep an open mind and keep progressing in that. I don't think I'm ever going to be super duper at it, possibly, but I bring my own. It's not for that per se. It's really for my own learning. So I'm enjoying it.
I wanted to take a break from the show and briefly share with you the difference that performance herbalism can make for you. Several years ago, I had Logan Christopher, CEO of Lost Empire Herbs, on the show to talk about hypnosis and mental training for athletes. While talking to him, I realized he also had an herbalism company. So shortly thereafter, I used the Phoenix formula, which was my first product I bought from them. I had great results with it, not only increasing my energy and decreasing my need for coffee and caffeine, but I also noticed that it was making an impact on my lifts and my weight room numbers. I was having a great training experience. Shortly thereafter, I also got into the Shilajit resin as well as other herbs. And I don't look at supplementation the same way. I'm a strong believer in what Logan and his company are doing in looking for a natural resource to boost human performance. If you want to check out the herbs that I use personally from Lost Empire Herbs, you can head to losttemporaryherbs.com/justfly. There you can get 15% off your order, and they offer a 365-day money-back guarantee. Definitely check them out. Let's get on back to the show. Cool. That's awesome. Yeah, the martial arts has been something I've really been looking forward to hopefully getting more into at some point. I think that is the more perspectives you can get, the better. Even if you don't take them all the way, it's like even just to be a generalist, just 20%. Just show me the top 20% of this. Yeah.
You can innovate a bit more because you've got some ideas from that, or just it triggers something. And the whole concept of things moving like a whip, that's pretty critical in throwing. It's pretty critical in running and jumping, and certainly in striking it is as well. So there's some common elements there which I've sort of, okay, that's kind of interesting. And you breathe like this. Oh, that's different to what I would expect. And there's just little bits and pieces that have been, good learnings for me. And I'm certainly going to keep doing it for a bit just to see what I can glean out of it. And, as you say, when you start to develop, and I think mastery is probably not the right term, certainly with the level I'm at, but some level of competence, you do learn things more deeply, and then you can transfer it perhaps to another modality. So, I think it's been interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. I think with other modalities too, Rafe Kelly, who was on recently, I'm just name dropping all these last guests, but they've left a lot of impacts on how I think about things. But he was talking about Israel Adesanya, who's a UFC fighter, who was a hip hop dancer until he was 17, 18. It's just he's like got all the moves. And
he's a Kiwi, so he's famous over here, mate. He's
That's awesome.
He's a pretty special athlete. Yeah.
But I have this feeling like the people who really generate that asymmetry and really work the spinal engine, you can't help but think that they have an innate sense of rhythm. You know what I'm saying? You watch Usain Bolt run and watch his shoulders, and there's just like this rhythm to it. And we talk about that in track, and I don't think you can generate that whip of momentum change and asymmetry without some rhythm, without some ability to sense your body and how that, because otherwise it's just, oh wait, am I supposed to lift my knees more? Wait, not that I would tell an athlete to do that, but
totally. And that's where the greatness comes, isn't it? Like there's some of these athletes that have this inherent rhythm or coordination or motor genius or whatever you want to call it. That they use all these slings and they bounce and they're kind of funky the way they move, and it's like it's spectacular to watch. And I went to a boxing event recently, and Israel Adesanya was there actually, and I was in the warm-up room and watching these guys prepare, and he was there, and there's music on, and he's just kind of bopping away in the corner there, and he's got presence, but he moves well. You can just see it didn't matter what the song was. It could be anything from something pretty hardcore to Adele singing or whatever it was, and he just moves well. There's something there's a rhythm there that's whether it's inherent or whether he's done years of hip hop, whatever, I'm not sure, but it's pretty cool. Like, and I think that's part of his greatness is that movement skill. He just he's 6'4" with long levers, and he's hard to get at and all the other stuff, but he's a great mover. So it's impressive.
Yeah, I'm starting to learn. The older I get and the more athletes I work with, the more I learn what it really means to be a good mover. And rhythm, and actually having rhythm, some level of rhythm present in the program. Like I had the other day, I was working with 4 distance runners, and a lot of times I just warm them up with isometrics, which is awesome. And hopefully we'll talk about that here in the next few minutes. But it was just one of those days. And I had just had a good workout myself like this. So in my time with Paul Cater, who's been on the show, and he's out in Monterey, he does warm-ups that are almost all to rhythm music with no lyrics and beat. And we did crawls to rhythm. We did hops to rhythm. We did lunges to rhythm and little jumps and all this stuff. And I mean, they liked it. That most of them liked it. It was 4, and then one of them didn't really like it very much. But they had a great time, and it was interesting because in watching, actually, you can see, and we did like a vertical jump in a single leg RSI where they hopped on and hopped up in the air. And the one athlete who didn't like the rhythm, she didn't raise her hand. I don't think she hated it, but she just struggled. And her single leg RSI was the worst. And as I was zooming in on like the foot to kind of look at it, she was the one who'd had no like little heel twitches or taps, if that makes sense, even on the subtle level. Like, and again, it's a small sample size, but even it's still like, I feel like even in hip hop dance and stuff, there's like these little twitches and these little ankle, these little hits of muscle contraction around the ankle that do matter. It is a big deal.
But even watching, who's the US discus? Is it Valerie Allman, the discus thrower?
Yeah, I think she's got the national record. She's throwing real far. I know that.
70-meter discus thrower who's a former ballet dancer, and you watch her throw, and she looks like a ballet dancer. It's like there's this rhythmic summation of it's beautiful, and she's not a huge I'm not sure what she weighs, but she doesn't look heavy. She's very she's lean and muscular, but probably less than 80 kilos, I would say, and throwing 70 meters. And you kind of think, wow, that's a rhythmic event too. And you can see that rhythm and that summation and the way she whips it. It's really cool. I mean, I think so. Yeah, probably something shooting ahead a little bit here, but training rhythm, dance, they're pretty good modalities for kids to be involved with, aren't they?
Yes.
Even though just dancing around to the music at home, that's all good stuff. I reckon that we probably don't do enough of in a lot of cases.
Yeah. My daughter is 4. She'll be 5 here in a few days. But one of her favorite things to do, and she'll do it with the music on or off, but you can tell when the music's on, she catches the beat of it. My wife got this little exercise trampoline that's like, I don't know, 2 feet across, like one of those little ones. And my daughter will just jump on that thing over and over and over and over again. And you can just tell she's got this rhythm. And I'll say, like, who knows why it is or what. I mean, I try to not be a coach at all. I just suggest, hey, do you want to play the ball? Do you want to jump over the stick? Sometimes I try to be as not seeking validation as possible. But what I've noticed over time, and I don't know if it's that specifically, but she relative to her peers at her age, as she's growing older, like her cousins, has gotten a lot faster. Like her speed has gotten way, way better. And I mean, it could be a lot of things, but that is something that she is always doing. And she catches rhythm. She's trying to do tricks in the air. I mean, she probably spends 20 minutes a day on that thing. And if music's on, she does it to the music. It's just interesting to watch, and you wonder what that's doing.
Well, it's interesting, the trampoline, we're getting way sidetracked, but there was Asher Phillip, who was the UK, I think she's a 100-meter champion back in the day, was also world junior trampoline champion and had this background on that. And I'd seen this data, not data, but just that anecdote. And then a year or so later, we had a girl won the New Zealand junior 100-meter championship. So I'm watching nationals and I'm going, wow, that girl's got an amazing touch on the ground. She's 5 foot tall, tiny little thing, but just bounced off the ground. And I didn't really think anything of it. And then I heard her coach speaking later on at a conference, and it turns out she was the North Island trampoline champion as well. So, who knows, whether it's rhythm, whether it's stretch shortening cycle, whether it's tendon stiffness, I don't know what it is, but there's something. The trampoline, I don't think is a bad thing to have in the system. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
It was funny because when my wife first brought that home, I was like, I don't know about this thing. Like, and then it's turned out to be the best investment. I think it only costs like $10 or something. It was like, it's been amazing.
Perfect.
I'm really glad we got that thing. All right. So the last thing I had with that was, I know I kind of shared my take with Helen Hall and my thoughts in terms of like integration, but what's your take on, who can benefit from it? Spinal Engine, like who can train it? I know you said you've been doing some of the Ben Patrick, like the QL lifts, which that's a cool way to think about that too. Haven't really thought about that, but
I think can everybody benefit from? I'm not sure. Like I said, I want to get a PhD student on it, and I've got a guy semi-lined up, just trying to get him some funding. But if you don't have certain anthropometric traits, for example, if you don't have a lordotic spine, you've got a very flat back, is it still beneficial? Well, I don't know. So look, there's some unanswered questions. So my working model currently is probably everybody can benefit from it to some level. Some might find it more advantageous than others. If you have that natural rhythm anyway, can we facilitate that? And then you look at certainly Kevin Myers' progression over a 5-year period. He was improving every year in the 100 meters, from 23 to 28, which is quite unusual. As you well know, people get to about 23 and most of them barely improve. And he had room to improve 11.1. He wasn't super fast, but improved 5 or 6 tenths of a second in 5 years. That's incredible. I mean, I've very rarely seen that.
Yeah.
Particularly, from a guy that was already well trained. He was already world junior champion in the decathlon, and I'd looked at his data and seen he'd scored like 8.4 at 22 or something in the decathlon. I thought, oh, that's really good. And then I looked at his numbers and I wrote him off. I thought, oh, he's not fast enough. He's never going to get any better because he's not fast enough. Can't be the world record holder. And here 5 years later, he's the world record holder. And hats off to those guys. That's amazing.
Yeah.
And he's fast. He's a 10.50 guy. He's one of the top, 4 or 5 guys in the decathlon in the 100 each time. He's getting good points there, and it's like, well, wow, that's pretty cool, and that's a real feat of coaching and the athletes training and stuff. I'm a big admirer of that work. That's impressive.
Yeah, I've been intrigued by it ever since you mentioned that they were doing awesome stuff over there. And I think it was because of you that at least one of the reasons that I ended up getting Jerome on the show and learned a lot talking to him. And so I know you were able to spend some time with him. I know one of his big things that I've worked on a lot is the long isometric holds, but what are some things that you observed in spending time with him that you've been mulling over yourself, and how has that inspired your thought process?
there was, as we said already, the lunge particularly, but it's several other movements he's doing with the lateral flexion involved. So it's more, he was mentored initially by Jay Schroeder and some of that stuff, and he's morphed the drills that I've certainly seen Jay doing to a bit more, 3D, if you like, with the lateral flexion. And I think that's an improvement. And whether that's been the catalyst for Kevin and some of the others improving the way they have, I'm not sure, but I wouldn't doubt that that's been part of it. So in terms of what I took out of it, I guess I've certainly, done more of that stuff with athletes I've worked with since that time was a couple of years ago now that I think it was with him. So certainly have taken that on board. He does a lot of asymmetrical things too in the training, and some of the holds are asymmetrical. And his answer to me was, oh, why don't I asked why aren't they doing the other side? And he'd sort of, I'm bringing him back to the middle, and he'd leave the answer sort of hanging there like that, and I'd be like, okay, what does that mean? So I guess it's developing symmetry, and if you always throw on one side, maybe you do the drill on the other side. And so his thing was, and he had some of these answers when I'd ask him a question, and he'd have this sort of and I appreciate it because it made me think about it. Why are you doing that? Well, that's what they need. Give the athlete what they need, and it's like so simple and it's so accurate in some ways, but therein lies the mastery of knowing what an athlete needs. And I certainly wouldn't pretend to understand all the stuff that he was doing. And I was only there 3 or 4 days. But yeah, really good experience, a really different way of training. Certainly, I wouldn't characterize him as a gym Nazi in terms of he does a lot of stuff. He does strength training, of course, but he does a lot of these isometric holds, and he was certainly using them in a space where they would do them daily. And I said, oh, why do you do that? And he just had these great answers that have stuck in my mind is, oh, why do you do it daily? Because when I take them out, they get worse. It's like, oh, well, can't argue with that, can you? Like, and it wasn't necessarily, hard data based, but it was, and I started thinking about it. He was almost using them as a active recovery, as well as a range of motion, as well as strength at length, and all those things I think kind of combine to give these athletes good movement quality. And like the old cliche of moving like a cat, having that sort of kind of, well, that's how they move. They've got range, they move well. They're not overly muscled. He had his Melina Robert-Michon, who's I think silver medalist in the 2016 discus at the Olympics. She was in there, and she's again not a huge athlete, but she's throwing high 60s in the discus, and wasn't excessively muscled, and it's just kind of cool to see a different way of looking at things. And certainly, she was doing a lot of isometric stuff, a lot of force absorption stuff, stepping off a box, stuff like that, and she was using that as her metric rather than, oh, I squatted 300 pounds. It was, oh, can I step off this box, of X height, land, in good posture, bare feet, on the balls of my feet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Can I do that? Well, okay. Then can I go up higher and do it? And that was her marker of, and when you think about it, you're absorbing force, you're posturally sound, you're taking it through your feet, all these things that you and I would probably agree on are valid things, but just was a different way of looking at it. And I thought that was kind of cool that they were doing it. He's had different mentors and different experiences, and certainly hard to argue with their results.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really cool with the asymmetry. And when you were saying asymmetrical, I was like, they're doing like a Russian lunge jump, like partial on one side, like the sprint, right? Like
you might do a push up hold in an asymmetrical position, but you don't change to the other side the same way. So that they'd be doing that, or they were doing they're doing the lunges just on one side.
Yeah,
every day, just that one side. I'm like, what the hell?
Interesting though.
But maybe that other leg's already mobile and strong because he hurdles with that other lead leg or whatever it is. It's just kind of like, bring them back to the middle, stay symmetrical. And we're all in, most events are somewhat asymmetrical anyway. Yeah. And so I guess it's kind of that. And I think Jay would probably sing from the same song sheet in terms of you just want athletes that move well, and being balanced and all those other things are part of that general movement quality. And like you look at, and Kevin Meyer's another one I would characterize as a motor genius. He's one of those guys that, and he wasn't even there when I was there, but you look at some of the stuff on Instagram, stuff he can do. He's doing ski jumps, he's doing backflips off waterfalls, he's surfing, he's playing tennis, he's dunking basketballs, he's doing all this stuff. The guy just moves well, and he's one of these guys that can take something and probably learn quite well. And he's he's probably the most balanced decathlete in the history of the event. He's good at everything. He hasn't got a bad event. We had previous world record holders, Daley Thompson, Ashton Eaton, that were guys that super fast, explosive runner jumpers, might not be so good in, a given throw or whatever. Myers good at everything. And that's, he's possibly not as fast naturally as some of those other guys, but he's fast enough and he's better at throwing, and he's got a great pole vault, and, it's pretty cool to see how that's manifested itself.
Yeah. The only doing one side, I get that in the sense, like I've seen just even out of like Z Health and some of the talking with Dan Fichter and some of the neurological like training stuff is, especially with, I took like the Z Health Essentials course, I don't know, 6 years ago. It's like a lot of neurological stuff, and basically how training on one side of the body. I also spent some time with Sean Sherman, who does a lot of that with the Square One system. Basically, like you're kind of on one side of the body. I don't want to butcher it, but basically you're either on like it's almost like a left arm, right arm is running the show, or right arm, left arm, something like that. Like one side of the body is kind of running the show and functional, and then the other side is not in control. I'm sure he could explain it much better than me, but with the Z Health, it was like there's one side of your body that you might neurologically like pressing, and you would do feedback. You would do like a kettlebell press with your left arm, right arm, test range of motion. And it was something to do with that. So I always found that interesting, but I think about, I had Mike Kozak and Stephen LaFlamme on the show, and Stephen LaFlamme was a Bill Hartman mentee with the physical therapy. And a lot of times, as from what I heard, some of the prescriptions to the athletes with issues was actually like only jumping off one side. Like you aren't getting in your right leg or something, or you're not loading your left leg very well. So only jump off that leg, or only do for a while to try to balance it out. So I definitely get that. I know for me, and when I do extreme iso lunges, it's easy for me to get down when my left leg is in front. I think a lot of people probably have this issue. I cannot get down into it very well with my right leg in front because I have like the AICP, the twisted hips. And so it's like, that's the side that I'm horrible at. So I feel like if I was going to just do one side, I would just do the right leg or something like that.
Totally. And I guess that's kind of the concept. And there's certainly some things I took it, because I'm probably the same as a lot of people. I've been, I've had something to work on more on the side. I do an extra set maybe on that side, but not all or nothing the way these guys were doing. I was like, wow, that's pretty dramatic. But why not? I mean, given that you always hurdle on one side, or you always throw one way, exactly. Or why wouldn't you be doing the stuff to bring them back to the middle? It just made a lot of sense. I just probably hadn't had the courage to go that dramatically in that space. So it was nice to see their success with it, and then it almost gives you the freedom to go, stuff it. I'm going to try that too with a much more dramatic ratio of loading on one side than the other for a given athlete.
Yeah, when I was doing track in high school, I did do hurdles in college for a few years, but I found that I high jumped and long jumped off my left leg and hurdled off my right leg, and I felt like that was a good. I don't know. I think balance. I did a lot of that too because I was real heel heavy in my left leg takeoffs, and I felt like that just slowed me down for hurdles. So the right leg was more natural, but that was a great balance. Like that was a good balance of things. And part of me almost wants now thinking about that to do. Yeah, if I'm working with like a high jumper, just like, hey, what if we just did step ups only on your right leg in the weight room? It's not the same motor pattern anyways. Like a step up is not a high jump.
No, exactly.
Why not?
Totally. Why not? Yeah.
That's interesting.
Definitely, it was interesting. Yeah,
I like too that, and because I had seen that Dan doing this, and I imagine, I don't know if who had originated. I think, like you said, it probably was Jerome, but like the lateral, because with the Helen Hall stuff and Gary Ward and like the lunges, like, and I spent time with Rocky Snyder too, and basically it was like a lunge, but you take your knee instead of straight ahead, it goes over the big toe, because that's like mid stance and pronation, and you're going to get more VMO and more glute doing that. And then one day I was like, hey, I should do my lunge holds like this. Why not? And just way more glute, way more VMO. And I felt it when I ran too. And so I had heard that with Jay's system. And I mean, the thing I love about Jay's system, Schrader's system, is it's just so simple. It's just, it's literally as bare as it can be. And it requires a lot more than just picking exercises, which is, I think, draws in intentionality and is massive. But yeah, I've heard that, like, why there's no 3D, there's no rotation. And I think on one end, it's easy to get crazy and dumb with 3D, like we're at the point where it's not helping anything, but just a simple side bend, a simple rotation. Yeah. People who do the iso lunges are like, oh, I don't feel my glute. Well, hey, just take your knee over your big toe. And that's like, oh, now you do.
And the thing too with it is, like when you go to the lateral, you bring the psoas under more stretch. The psoas obviously is attached to the lumbar spine. You bring that on more stretch. So you actually are getting more length on some of those critical elements, as well as the potential movement range. And you look at some of Myers' stuff on Instagram, and his range is beautiful. He's a guy, pretty well muscled. He's even training plantar flexion range, like a dancer. He's doing. If you scroll back through some of his Instagram stuff, there's pictures of him kneeling with his foot, just his toes touching something, and he's actively stretching through that sort of plantar flexion range. It's like, and then you watch him run, and he has this massive impulse through his feet. That he really, and more so than certainly a lot of sprint coaches would recommend. He finishes. He can get. He's like a swimmer or a dancer with the amount of plantar flexion he can get. I'm like, it's just a different model, and it's like if you look at, I think we've kind of as a sports science community, sprint training community, we've probably bought in a lot into that front side dominant Ralph Mann, sort of given all that evidence in that space. But there's some recent papers. I think it's Haugen 2018, and there's another paper, recent paper 2021, Matz, I think it is, something like that, have shown there really isn't any objective effect or a positive effect for people that are more front side or more rear side. You run with what you run with what you've got, I guess, and there doesn't seem to be this dramatic effect that maybe we've been told to expect from these sprint training models. So and certainly that some of these French athletes are very stride length dominant, and they have been historically. Mary-Jose Perec was a monster stride length. Christine Aron, who's still got the European 100-meter record, I think, did it in like 42 or 43 steps herself. She ran 10:73 as a female athlete, like just ate up the track. And Christophe Lemaitre was another stride length monster. Yeah. Myers a stride length monster, and that they have a different lens on it, and it works. Cool. I just think it's just interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting that the French are like that. Yeah, I wonder why. It's interesting. I think about someone like Kevin, because I think a lot of people, if you told people to try to create that stride length, they would just get slower. Like they couldn't do it. It's amazing. Yeah. I feel like you almost need
hardware, software thing, isn't it?
You need that many movement options. When you have that many movement options and you're that good of an athlete, you can figure out a way to make that stride length that way. Because even with the front side thing, I've never had an athlete who lifted their knees more and went faster ever. It's not if it happens because you're doing other things, okay, that's cool. I get it, but totally. And that's where I'm really curious. I'm going to have to put Kevin's stuff in the show notes. And I just, now I'm like, especially even the plantar flexion, the little nuances that make that. It's really interesting.
Yeah, crazy. You watch there's some videos on there that you can see, and you're like, that's like a swimmer or a dancer. That range of track athletes don't do that. Well, he's doing it, and he's getting faster. It's like, it's kind of it just opens your mind to possibility.
Yeah. That's cool. That's awesome. Well, I'm interested to dissect that. What was the plantar flexion? You said there was a stretch or an exercise with plantar flexion that he was doing.
I'll send you an image of it. I've got it saved on file, so I'll send it to you. You can put it in the show notes.
We'll throw it in there. That's interesting. It's just so cool to see, for me to think about the human body is. And John Kiley, who was on the show a while ago, he had written an article about it was like a runner who was missing their whole calf or hamstring or something, where it would have been a huge crippling liability. It wasn't a sprint, it was a distance runner, but they still did really well. And their body was able to figure out a way to do it. And there was probably some asymmetry too that was helping them along. It's just, there's not just one way to do things. It's so cool to see how different proportion people can, if their movement potential is there. And again, I think that's probably why we can say ode to enough play in childhood and those types of things too. I mean, I do think some people are born a little more stiff than others, but just having movement options, and you can create as you go later in life.
Yeah, definitely.
With some of the long duration ISOs, just from a pure physiology perspective, do you utilize those, in your training session, begin, end, off frequency? Have you given that a lot of thought after spending time with Jerome? Or?
Yeah, I have, and I guess I think you've had Keith Barr on your show as well. And I guess, if you combine those concepts, that he would say, Keith Barr would say that you're developing tendon compliance with those long isometric holds, which is great in terms of, he would, his, and I apologies to Keith if I get this wrong, but his mantra seems to be that, compliant tendons, less soft tissue injuries as a result, because, there's not such an abrupt force of it overpowering the muscle, for example. So, he would say that if you've got a lot of soft tissue, muscle belly injuries, you'd want to develop a more compliant tendon. You do your long duration isometrics. You might do your short duration isometrics or your more ballistic work to develop stiffer tendon. And I think that's really valid and probably true. I guess it's broader than that too. I think the long duration isometrics also develop strength at length because it's time and attention. You're actively pulling and you're actively engaged. They're great mobility tools. So yeah, we do them for some athletes that are chronically tight in an area. We'll do them there. I've played with them reasonably extensively myself, and yeah, some of the postural elements of them are great. There's even those the push up hold and those sort of things on the parallelettes. Getting extreme range and strength in those positions is great. Certainly our throwers have done some of that stuff. We haven't probably done it as religiously as say Jay would do it or Jerome would have done it. And has that been to our detriment? Possibly, possibly not. I'm not sure. Hard to know when you've got such small sample sizes. But yeah, I mean, one of the other things that I know Jerome sort of alluded to me was it helps recover. He regularly does HRV type stuff, and he would sort of suggest that they recover better. Their HRV becomes more, as a better score essentially with post an isometric session. Oh, that's kind of interesting. And do you have to do the 5 minutes that certainly Jay would have proposed back in the day? I don't know. I don't know that you do. And I'm not the expert, but this my gut feeling was if you develop it, you can probably get away with tapping the wheel and doing 1 or 2 minutes because you've already got it. And that motor pattern's there, the range is there, the strength and length's there. Okay, now you spend your juice on something else, some other training element you need to work on. And I'm not sure whether they'd agree or disagree on that, but I think that's probably what Jerome does at some level. His elite guys don't spend as much time on it because they've already got it. So yeah, it's an interesting can of worms, and I don't think anybody's probably got a global handle on it as much as they might like to think they have. There'd be a lot of elements that are involved in it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of fun when there is a lot of mystery around that stuff. Like,
yeah, totally.
You have to do it yourself. One of the things, it was Jeremiah Flood was on the show recently talking about how they'll either warm up with, if the athletes are walking in there kind of down, they'll play a game. Otherwise, they'll do isometrics for the warm up. And that got me, I don't know, just something clicked in my mind when he had said that. I had heard these like crazy stories before of Jay's athletes, which some of those stories are just, I don't know, they're just crazy. But one of them was like, oh, this guy did like a 5-minute isometric lunge and then shook out his arms and then benched his max or something like stuff like that. And I remember telling swimmers, some swimmers once that we were going to do, we didn't go max, but it was before. I would always, the conservative side of me would always put the isos at the end to like stretch and recover and kind of be a dual purpose. And you could bring the team together and we could all do it. And then with those guys, we did at the beginning, it was just 3 minutes. I just put 3 minutes on the clock and said, do as much as you can. And when people would go down, I'd really encourage them to get back. And they were dying. Like they were just straight up dying after that. And then they are like, no, we didn't bench our max. We were destroyed. But I think that you could say that they weren't getting they weren't conditioned to that. So if you're not conditioned, it's going to get you. But also they probably were not like letting it truly lengthen either. So a combination. Anyways, I that kept me away from that from a long time. And then Jeremiah said that they did that before. And he had a video of a girl doing like a PR on a vertec. It was like a single leg running jump. And he was like, this was after a 5-minute iso lunge or however long, 3, I don't know, 5. And like 100 drops. And then she went and did that. And I was like, huh. And then I just remember all the stories I've heard of Jay's training. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to start trying this out. And I started doing that kind of thing in my own training. And I'd been told like do 5-minute iso lunge hold 11 times a week and then do some sprints. And for some reason that didn't work amazingly well for me, but what seemed to have worked is just using the isos as a warm-up and building up to and start with 2 minutes and something that's feasible and like 10 drops and then just building up a little bit. And my training is in one of the best places it's been in the past few years. Just being able to go walk in the gym any given day, I can do at least a good 4-minute hold, some days 5 if I really want to. I can do at least a good 2 to 230 push-up, and I just recover well. I recover better, and it's a thing too. You had said you had posted this when I was looking through your Twitter a little bit to think of some questions this time around, and you had posted something where static stretching before a sprint, 2 60-meter sprints, you'd static stretch, and then they had like static stretching and dynamic stretching, and a group that did nothing, or I don't know, just like danced around. I don't know what they did, but like the static stretch group, the first sprint was negligible, but then they did the second one, and that's where the static sprint did better. And you could say, well, that's where the negative of the static stretching were off, but you're saying there's a lot of good things that happen in an extreme iso hold. Like mobility is one, but I also think there's like an energetic thing. Like maybe the Cori cycle and the muscles. There's just a lot of good stuff, but it's also really draining to do that every day, to be like, all right, time to train.
Yeah, emotionally too. Like, 5 minutes is, yeah, I agree. And whether, I remember trying to build up to do a 5-minute iso lunge each side, and it pretty much gave me a tension headache, just because it was brutal. I thought, oh, yeah, maybe I'm doing this wrong. I don't know, but interesting. After doing a big block of that for maybe 6 weeks, I was running across a road, and I'm 52 years old now, and I've got a bung knee, and all the rest of it, and I running across the road, car comes around the corner, and I've got to sprint to not get run over, and I took off. I thought, wow, I haven't felt like that for about 20 years. I just took off. And I felt really fast, and I was like, "Holy shit!" Obviously there's an adrenal spike and all the rest of it went with it, but just the pattern of I was mobile and I was strong in those postures, and it was like, "Hey, look, there's something in it. Finding the balance and what's right for you and the next person." That's part of the art of coaching, isn't it? Rather than the science, probably at this point.
Yeah, that's what I've heard about that stuff too, is sometimes you feel bad when you're training, there's a lot of fatigue, but when you get in the competition, like there's just a jump, those situations. What was it? Another thing that I found interesting is the consistency. And actually I had heard this from Jay Schrader, is the consistency of the athletes that he worked with to perform at a very high, they're very near their max outputs on a regular basis. And honestly, ever since I've been doing the ISO stuff and then a few drops, I don't do the 100 drops. It might be like 10 to 20, maybe 30 on one day. But I've noticed insane consistency compared to where I used to be. It's been really interesting for whatever reason. I don't know what reason, but so that's been my muse.
Yeah, I concur with that.
Yeah. 5 minutes is, if I had to do 5 minutes every day, I would, and that's the thing I've heard, at least athletes who do have to do that a lot, that's easy to get burned out doing that stuff. Like just adrenal, like Christian Tuba talks about adrenaline, like it's just just like, all right, 5 minute lunge today, here we go. Like it's a lot.
No. Yeah.
It is. I don't know. It is. There's something to be said about, when you do it, you got to own it and dialing in.
Yeah.
And I just love the intentionality of it. It's like a meditation, it's just a boom. Like this is a way to use pain to draw intention and the urgency. So awesome. Anything with short isometric holds that you've been using or thinking about? It's been a while since we talked, and the Alex Natera stuff has been popular since then.
So some of the Alex Natera stuff, I've certainly used it in sort of hamstring related stuff, but in terms of like the mid thigh pull and some of those other, I don't like that violent load on the spine when nothing moves. I've got 3 bulge discs in my back from stupid training I did as a young fella, and had subsequent back surgery, so I'm a little bit probably one burnt twice shy sort of guy on some of those. I don't do a lot of like a squat against a movable object or a mid thigh pull. I kind of have shied away from that a little bit. That said, I think that there's enough stuff which shows tendon stiffness, rate of force development, and all those sort of positive qualities, I guess, for most people, can be developed through those, for want of a better word, ballistic isometrics, where you might be, bang, hold it for 2 seconds or 1 second, or try to reach peak force. So, I'm not against them. I'm just a little bit wary for some modalities, but certainly have done some of that hamstring stuff that I've, stolen from Alex Natera's stuff that he's presented online a couple of times. So, yeah, I see the value. I just don't load it through the trunk. I guess is probably how my kind of rule of thumb currently.
Gotcha. So, that makes sense. I've heard people say, I've had coaches tell me too how good of results they've gotten from like top end speed. I mean, I think this stuff works awesome. I guess I have heard that it can create more compression, that like it is a very compressive situation. And so you would grab, just because to err on the side of less compression, you would be more like the one where like your back is on a bench and your foot is on like your horizontal. It's like a single leg, straight leg hip thrust kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like
and you can load it. You can load that, and you can do the violent absorption ones as well, and all those sort of things. So I certainly have done those ones, and I'd probably be more if you did a belt squat type situation rather than a bar on the shoulders job. I'd be more likely to be keen to do that with my athletes than a mid thigh pull or a traditional squat into the rack type scenario. But that said, not to say that they're wrong. I'm just wary of them. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really powerful training stimulus. I'm always, there's always a balance, right? Like really powerful, effective, but a lot of compression and just factors to look at. And then also like, can you get the same thing doing a plyometric, or, maybe just pairing it with the plyometric to half the load of it, or I don't know, like those types of questions. I think like they do just use like the single leg. I mean, still, if you could still crank it, there's certainly still compression, but like doing a double like a mid thigh pull is like mad compression. So it's definitely up in the ante if you're bilateral.
And particularly for strong athletes, like, and if you're having a competition, I've done X number of Newton meters, and what are you doing? And it just scares me a little. But that's maybe I'm being ultra conservative. I'm not sure. But,
I don't have any for like I've done some quasi versions of those that I do really like, but it's not max in the sense that there's not like we'll just put as many plates at the bar as we can and just have the athlete lift it off an inch. Okay, you got it. All right, we'll put a little bit more on. I don't have force plates, so I can't. That's as good as I got. And I do think that for that scope, I don't see like too much happening with that. But I would ask, like, can we do the same with the like hopping or plyometric type stuff too, if we wanted to do it that way. I like the hip thing though. I really wish I had the setup to really crank that with a force plate. I've heard that can be a really awesome thing. I think it would help me personally too for speed.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, good stuff. All right. Well, we've taken a good amount of time on some of this, on some of the initial questions, which is awesome. It's good to have those conversations. Maybe I'll just ask one more question, which is thoughts on proprioceptive style training. And I asked this because you had mentioned the effect of weightlifting or heavy weightlifting on joint proprioception or muscle proprioception. So what's your thought on the interplay of weightlifting, joint proprioception, and then utilization or purpose of like some of the Marvin Marinovich stuff, like the balance discs, or if the foot is on a hard but unstable surface, and that any benefits there with that type of stuff as you see it?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. I spent a wee bit of time with Gavin McMillan, who I think was mentored probably by Marvin Marinovich and his cohort there. So that was, I don't know how many years ago that was, but he's a very smart guy and had some, he took me through some of the drills that they used. And certainly as a guy who'd probably trained myself in a more strength orientated fashion, I thought there's something in this. And I was pretty pathetic at some of the movements, because I just didn't have that sort of, that feel. So yeah, look, I do think there's a balance. And it's a bit like the stuff I was talking about earlier with the spinal engine versus the mass spring model or whatever you want to, how you want to differentiate the way people move. But it's not a case of just do the balance stuff in my mind and forget all the raw force stuff. Do both. And I think some of the massive proponents of that sort of training that I don't know. Do you know Koji Murafushi?
Yeah, I've seen some of his training too. Very like artistic, almost like.
He's got all these hammers off the bars and he's stabilizing and everything's kind of funky and he's a big proponent of that sort of training. And he's a very smart guy, done his PhD on the biomechanics of hammer throw, Olympic champion in the hammer. And it's kind of interesting. It's like, oh, that's pretty amazing. And that's all you need to do. Is it? Okay, cool. But then you go back and to look at his training history and the guy power cleaned, 195 kilos, 430. He's got a 40-something inch vertical.
Yeah, I've heard his vertical is insane. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's run his 60-meter time is insane as well. He's just this mega athlete. And it's like, okay, so you came into this other style of training with a background of a nearly 200 kilo power clean. Like, well, yeah, I can see how that works. You've combined these two elements. You had this enormous horsepower and potentially lacking in feel. And I don't know if you've heard the term motor unit enslavement. When you do the same movement all the time, and you sort of maybe you're paring away synapses and you become very good at that movement, but you're not very flexible. And I think that's possibly what you do with if you OD on strength training and you don't do some of this other balanced proprioceptive work on the side, that maybe you become this very inflexible in a motor sense, and you don't move as well as you can. So look, I think it's nice to balance these two diverse types of training from the proprioceptive balance focused work with possibly some high speed elements with your raw strength stuff. And I think one of the guys that Gavin McMillan, I think, and Marvin Marinovich had worked with extensively was Troy Polamalu, who was obviously a very, very special athlete. And Gavin said to me, he's the best athlete I've ever worked with, and he's worked with a whole lot of studs, and he said he's the best. And so I looked at him up a little bit, and I watched him play on some obviously there's a lot of footage of his on YouTube and what have you, and like, wow, what a specimen. But the thing is, you look at his pre Marv Marinovich training, the guy was bench pressing over 400 pounds. He had a 40-inch vertical jump, and he had all these other. So he again, he was like Koji Murafushi. He had this enormous force generation ability, and then you added what he didn't have, perhaps, and became even more of a stud. Like it's kind of like, well, again, it's balance. I'm not. I think both are good. Yeah. Long story short.
Yeah. Someone had told me, I don't remember who told me this or it was accurate, but that Polamalu, when he was training with Marinovich, would still go and lift weights like behind Mars back or something, like, because they were very anti, like, and I can see why, in the sense of a lot of those athletes have gotten to the point where they aren't getting any return off of that typical weightlift. They're in motor enslavement. There's not, and I think about even like repetition without repetition. You're never going to run the 100-meter dash the exact same way. Even a single leg squat, like I'm into like doing just different types of single leg squats and like working the ball of the foot more, working the heel more. And you never really do it the exact same way when there's more degrees of freedom. But as soon as it's like on 2 feet now, and there's a bar, and there's just less room to wiggle. You're more like apt to kind of be stuck. And I like how Marv said, when you put a foot on like a balance disc, your body gets to pick where it wants to go. And I imagine it's almost makes the lifting more like what your body does in running and jumping. There's just more little nuances that's going to let itself.
There's more bandwidth, isn't there, that you have to play with. And I was, to be honest, I was really impressed with this time I spent with Gavin McMillan. The guy's a really bright guy, and he's getting results, and he had a lot of good athletes there that are coming out of there, and he's moved more into the UFC type stuff now. But he had Carla Niles, I think, was there, that the US Sevens rugby player who's super fast, and he's impressive, and there's some really good stuff in there. But like there's many ways of skinning a cat, aren't there? Like we all have different recipes that we come up with, and we probably all get some results at the end of the day, unless we're doing something drastically wrong. I try not to get too much of a massive proponent of any one thing. I try to what's good, what can I use? Does that fit in my model in my own mind? If it doesn't, why doesn't it? Well, how come it's working? And well, maybe my model's wrong. I want to stay flexible. That I don't have all the answers, and I want to keep learning. So, but part of me, and maybe it's my own bias. I look at those guys that have been really successful in some of that stuff, but they did have this big force background earlier. I'm a little bit married to the force stuff probably, and I want to think that they wouldn't have done it without that. Maybe they would. I don't know. But certainly, I know we have athletes in New Zealand that are. We've got a couple of elite throwers that come to mind, and one of them is massive strength training history. One of them started strength training at 18, and they're both world class now. But the one that started strength training at 18 has better motor skills. The one that started strength training at 10 or 11 is way stronger. Like, okay, but they throw the same distance, or actually the one that started strength training later actually throws further. But it's just kind of interesting. Like I think it affords that coordination is an underrated thing, and I think so. I certainly hats off to Marv Marinovich and co in that space. They are developing coordination and movement speed and competencies in a reasonably good bandwidth, but force is good too.
Yeah, so, it's certainly the athletes who have the horsepower that are probably going to shine the most when they're exposed to that kind of thing, at least to a large degree, I'd imagine. I'm not the strongest. Like I have some okay lifts in my history, but not great by any means. And I felt like I did do well with that type of work. But that was a year. Then when I first did it, it was a year after I was pretty strong squat. Like the year I high jumped 2.14 meters, I was actually my strongest squat to body weight I'd ever been. And squatting well, like letting my knees come forward, keeping a fairly vertical torso. Actually, a lot of pressure on the balls of my feet, and I didn't even think about why. It just felt good and stuff like that. Yeah. And then I got into all that Marinovich stuff the next year. And I don't remember what turned me onto it. I got Probot X and started doing a lot of it. And I loved it. I just felt really good. But I wonder, I think if maybe I hadn't been able to have those force outputs prior, I don't know if I would have been quite as good with it. Like I think there is that kind of that maybe back and forth with it.
I mean, there is. You look at some athletes that are really, really good at the force stuff, and they're pretty good at their event. And then you look at another athlete that's pretty crappy at the force stuff, but just as good at the event. And you kind of think, well, is there a happy medium? And I we do get married to the modality that we are in, but you want the athlete that's most efficient as possible, don't you? Like that's obviously the goal. if you can get away with not doing that much strength work and still get the output, great. But can you get both? And if you can get that efficiency up, maybe it's easier to add strength. Any idiot can get strong, can't they, to some extent? And that subtleties of some of those other movement qualities are probably a little bit more nuanced and a bit more of an eye required to coach that, perhaps.
Yeah, it's definitely an art to it, and but all really interesting stuff for sure. Well, shoot, I'd like to ask you the last two, but we spent so long on the first couple, which was great. It was really, really interesting, and I have a ton of videos to put in the show notes now. I'm really excited to actually check them all out and get this whole thing set up. It's going to be a really great show, and front to back, everyone listening, go to the website and check out the show notes. But thank you so much for your time, Angus. It's great to reconnect from all the way across the world, pretty much. So
no, it's very good. I'll send you a couple of images that was some of the stuff we talked about too. I'll figure that through to you on email.
All right. Well, sounds good. Well, thank you again. I appreciate it. That wraps up another show. Thanks for being here with us, and we'll see you next week.